5,000 years ago, in the flat river plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, a people looked up at the sky every single night and saw something we no longer see. Not stars, not clouds. They saw a ceiling, a solid, curved, physical ceiling stretched over the entire world like an upside-down bowl, sealing the earth off from an ocean of water that surrounded everything on every side. This was not poetry to them. This was not a metaphor, and it was not a campfire story told to frighten children. This was their science. This was, as far as they were concerned, the honest and literal shape of reality. And the strange part is not that they believed it. Almost every ancient culture on Earth believed some version of it, independently, on every continent, without contact with each other. The strange part is how specific, how detailed, and how oddly consistent their description of this sky ceiling actually was. And stranger still is that centuries later, people who have spent their working lives at 40,000 feet, professional pilots, have described things in the upper sky that echo in an eerie and uncomfortable way. Exactly what these ancient scribes carved into clay. Let's start where the story starts, in Sumer, the oldest civilization we have written records for in what is now southern Iraq. The Sumerians did not think of the universe as empty space stretching out forever in all directions. To them, the universe was closed. It was a sealed system, a kind of cosmic terrarium. At the bottom was the flat disk of the earth. Below that was a dark underworld, and beneath that, a freshwater ocean they called the Abzu. Above the earth was air, the domain of the wind god Enlil, and high above that air, sealed over the entire world like a lid on a pot, was the dome. They called the god of this dome An, and to the Sumerians, An was not just a god who lived in the sky, and literally was the sky. The dome and the deity were the same thing, folded into one concept, in a way that is difficult for modern minds, trained on the idea of empty space to fully absorb. The first thing the Sumerians said about this dome is that it was not a single surface. It was layered. Multiple solid vaults stacked one over another, like the shell of an onion, each one distinct from the one below it, each one home to something different. Some texts describe 3 of these vaults. Other traditions, expanded later by the Babylonians who inherited Sumerian cosmology almost wholesale, describe 7. The lowest dome, the one closest to us, was said to be made of jasper, and this was the layer where the stars were fixed, like gems pressed into stone. Above that came a middle dome, built from a stone the texts call Sagalmut, and this was described as the dwelling place of a class of gods known as the Igigi, the younger, more active gods of the pantheon who were said to labor and move between realms. And above that, higher still, was the outermost dome, made of a stone called Luludanitu, and this final highest vault was the personal domain of An himself, the ceiling above all ceilings, the outer boundary of the entire created universe. The second thing they said, and this is the part that modern readers often find it genuinely unsettling, is that this dome was not simply decorative. It had a job. It was load-bearing. Its function was to hold back water. Above the dome, according to the texts, was an ocean, the same primordial saltwater sea, personified as the goddess Namu, that the world itself had originally been born out of. In Sumerian thought, the earth was not surrounded by nothing. It was surrounded by everything, by an infinite ocean, and the only thing standing between human beings and total drowning was this dome above their heads. Rain in the system was not simply condensation falling from clouds in an atmosphere. Rain was water leaking through, or being deliberately allowed through, controlled gates in the solid firmament above. The sky, quite literally, had windows, and when it rained hard, the ancients believed those windows had been opened. The third thing worth understanding is how this dome was said to have come into being in the first place, because in Sumerian myth, the sky was not always separate from the earth. According to the prologue to the epic sometimes called Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, in the very beginning there was only Namu, the primeval sea, existing alone with nothing else. Namu gave birth, without any father, to the sun god Utu, and then went on to produce An, who was the sky, and Ki, who was the earth. And here is where it gets interesting, because An and Kai were not separate at first. They were joined together, merged, a single undivided mass. It was only through the actions of their son, Enlil, the god of wind and storm, that heaven and earth were physically torn apart. Enlil pried An away from Kai, lifted the sky upward and sealed it into its dome shape, and carried the sky off as his own possession, while the earth remained below as a separate territory. In other words, the dome, according to the Sumerians, was not a natural or eternal feature of the universe. It was manufactured. It was the result of a specific act of separation performed by a specific god at a specific moment using specific effort. Something was pulled apart and then locked into that new configuration. The fourth thing they said concerns what lies beneath, because the dome above was mirrored by a corresponding structure below. Underneath the flat surface of the earth was the underworld, a dark, shadowy realm the Sumerians called Kur, later known by the name Irkalla, and beneath even that was the Abzu, a freshwater ocean, the domain of the god Enki. This meant the entire Sumerian universe was structurally symmetrical, salt water above, held back by a stone dome, land in the middle where humans lived, freshwater below, sitting underneath a shadowy land of the dead. The living occupied a kind of narrow, habitable slice, squeezed between two oceans, protected on both sides by solid barriers. It's worth pausing on how deliberate that symmetry is. This wasn't an accident of storytelling. It reflects a worldview in which the Earth is not floating in infinite space at all, but rather sealed, front and back, top and bottom, inside a finite, engineered structure. The fifth thing, and this is where Sumerian belief becomes almost architectural rather than purely mythological, is the idea that this dome was reachable, and that there were structures built specifically to reach toward it. The great stepped temple towers the Sumerians built, called ziggurats, were widely understood as bridges, physical connectors between the flat human world and the layered dome above. Priests would climb these towers not simply as an act of devotion, but as a symbolic act of ascent, moving upward, through the layers that mirrored the layers of heaven itself. In some interpretations, the very design of these ziggurats, tier stacked on tier, was meant to visually and physically echo the tiered structure of the sky dome. Above, Jasper heaven over Sagalmut heaven over An's outer heaven. The building was, in a sense, a small model of the universe, constructed so that human beings could stand at its peak and feel, however briefly, that they had climbed a rung closer to the gods. The sixth thing worth mentioning is the celestial bodies themselves, because to the Sumerians, the sun, moon, and planets were not simply lights hanging in the dome. They were the physical presence of gods moving along fixed and understood paths beneath its surface. Venus was Inanna, goddess of love and war. The sun was Utu, her brother, the god of justice. The moon was their father, Nana. These were not decorations. Each moving light in the sky was a family member, a relative, a deity with a personality, a temperament, a set of demands, traveling along the underside of the great dome on a route the priests believed they could track and predict. The regular motion of these lights across the vault was, to the Sumerians, proof of order in the universe, proof that the dome above was not chaotic, but governed, structured, obedient to a system. The seventh thing concerns who was allowed up there, because access to the dome and everything above it was, according to Sumerian belief, strictly and permanently forbidden to ordinary human beings. Heaven was the private residence of the gods, full stop. It was not a destination for the human soul after death. When a person died in Sumerian belief, their spirit did not rise. It descended downward into that same dark underworld of Kur, ruled by the goddess. Ereshkigal, a bleak shadow realm where the dead were said to continue a faded, dust-eating version of the life they had lived above. There was no reward for good behavior in this system, and no punishment for bad behavior either. Every soul, regardless of how they had lived, ended up in the same gray twilight underground. The dome, the layered heaven above, remained permanently off limits, sealed not just physically but spiritually, a space that belonged only to An and to those born of his line. The eighth thing is the sheer thickness that later scribal traditions, expanding on the Sumerian base, assigned to the dome itself, because once you accept that the sky is solid, you eventually have to ask yourself exactly how solid, how thick, how heavy that ceiling actually is. Later, rabbinic commentators working within this same broadly shared ancient Near Eastern framework debated the question directly, some proposing that the firmament was many layers thick, others arguing it was as thin as a single finger's width, and still others describing a journey of literally hundreds of years needed to travel from the earth up to the base of the lowest dome. These numbers vary wildly and were clearly never meant to be taken as physics in the way we'd use the term today. But what they reveal is telling. An entire intellectual tradition, spanning centuries and multiple cultures, treated the solidity, thickness, and physical properties of the sky as a legitimate, serious subject worth debating, calculating, and arguing over. Nobody in that world was treating the dome as a poetic flourish. They treated it as an engineering problem. The ninth thing, and the one that brings us to the strangest part of this whole story, is that this was never a uniquely Sumerian idea to begin with. It shows up almost everywhere, independently, in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia at all. In Egypt, the sky was the goddess Nut, arched bodily over the earth, her limbs forming the four corners of the dome, her body sometimes described in later texts as being made of solid metal, giving rise to words for thunder that literally translate to the sound of metal being struck. In parts of the Pacific Islands, elders describe the sky as a glass-like dome that touched the earth at the horizon, a place where, if you walked far enough in a straight line, you could eventually reach up and physically touch it with your fingers. In southern Africa, the Thonga people described heaven as an immense, solid vault resting directly on the earth, with a specific point where the two met, a point where women could lean their tools against the sky itself while working. In Japanese, Native American, and Siberian folklore, there are stories of arrows shot straight upward that struck something solid and lodged there instead of falling back down. Stories of holes and cracks in the firmament that people could climb through to reach the world above, and stories of sailors navigating ships to the exact spot where sky meets sea, so low there that the ship's own mast would scrape against it. This isn't one culture's fantasy copied by its neighbors. This is dozens of unconnected human societies, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, independently arriving at strikingly similar conclusions about a solid barrier over their heads. Scholars studying this pattern have gone as far as calling the belief in a solid sky essentially universal among pre-scientific peoples, describing it as, in effect, a natural default conclusion the human mind reaches when it looks up without the tools of modern astronomy. So, that's 9 things, drawn directly from what survives of Sumerian religious texts and the broader ancient Near Eastern tradition that grew out of them. The dome came in layers. It held back an ocean above. It was formed by tearing heaven away from earth. It was mirrored by a symmetrical structure below the ground. It was physically approached through ziggurats. It carried the moving bodies of gods across its underside. It was permanently closed to human beings after death. Later, scholars argued fiercely over its precise thickness, and none of this was unique to Sumer at all, but showed up in strikingly similar form across the ancient world. Taken together, this paints an incredibly consistent picture of a finite, sealed, engineered universe, built rather than simply existing, and separated from human beings by a barrier nobody down here was ever meant to cross. Now here is where the story shifts, and where it's important to be very careful and very honest about what we're actually dealing with, because this is where ancient mythology gets pulled into a modern conversation it was never originally part of. In recent years, a growing body of online content has tried to connect this ancient dome imagery to something entirely different. Modern claims, made mostly on social media and in flat earth communities, that commercial and military pilots have privately reported hitting some kind of barrier, boundary, or dome at extremely high altitudes. The claim usually goes something like this: that pilots flying at the very edges of controlled airspace have described a kind of ceiling, an invisible wall they cannot pass beyond, and that this modern pilot experience somehow validates what the Sumerians were describing thousands of years earlier. It's a compelling story, and it's worth understanding exactly why it circulates and exactly why it does not hold up under scrutiny. The honest, verifiable explanation for why aircraft cannot climb indefinitely has nothing to do with hitting a physical dome, and everything to do with basic atmospheric physics that is well understood, well documented, and taught in every aviation school on the planet. As an aircraft climbs, the air around it becomes progressively thinner. Lift, the force that keeps a plane in, the air depends directly on air density, so as the aircraft rises and the air thins out, the wings generate less and less lift for the same speed. At the same time, jet engines depend on oxygen-rich air to generate thrust, and that same thinning atmosphere reduces engine performance right alongside it. Eventually, an aircraft reaches an altitude where it simply cannot generate enough lift or thrust to climb any higher, no matter how the pilot angles the plane. This altitude is well known. It's called a service ceiling. It's published in the technical specifications of every aircraft ever built, and it varies by aircraft type, not by some mysterious external barrier. A commercial airliner might have a service ceiling somewhere in the low 40,000-foot range. Military aircraft, purpose-built with more powerful engines, can climb much higher, some reaching into the 70 or even 80,000-foot range, well beyond where any commercial pilot would ever fly. If there really were a physical dome capping the sky, we would expect every aircraft, regardless of design, engine power, or purpose, to hit the exact same hard limit. Instead, what we actually observe is exactly what physics predicts: different aircraft reaching different maximum altitudes depending entirely on their engineering, which is the opposite of what a shared, solid ceiling would produce. There's also the separate and often repeated claim that pilots have to constantly angle their aircraft downward to compensate for the Earth's curvature, or else they would supposedly fly off into space, and that this is somehow suspicious or points to a hidden truth about the sky. In reality, this claim misunderstands very basic geometry. An aircraft in level cruise flight is essentially flying parallel to the ground beneath it. And because the Earth curves, flying level actually means the plane's flight path also curves gently along with the planet's surface, without any special or unusual pilot input being required at all. Commercial aircraft are also built with what's called longitudinal static stability, meaning that if a plane is disturbed from level flight and the pilot takes no action whatsoever, the aircraft naturally returns to level flight on its own, purely through its own aerodynamic design. Investigators and aviation professionals who have directly circulating online have found something else worth mentioning too. Several of the social media accounts presenting themselves as flat Earth-believing pilots have been caught posting their own photographs and videos which clearly show the Earth's curvature in the background, sometimes while the caption directly above the image insists the Earth is flat. These are not sources holding up under basic scrutiny. So where does that leave the comparison the original question raises between ancient Sumerian dome cosmology and modern claims about pilots? The honest answer is that these are two very different kinds of things, and putting them side by side, while dramatic, isn't really an apples-to-apples comparison. The Sumerian material is a genuine, well-documented ancient belief system, the product of a pre-scientific people doing their best to explain what they observed in the sky above them, using the only intellectual tools available at the time. It deserves to be studied and understood on its own terms as a real and fascinating piece of human intellectual history, not dismissed or mocked. The modern pilot dome claim, on the other hand, is something else entirely. A set of assertions that don't survive contact with basic aviation physics, made mostly through anonymous or unverifiable social media accounts, some of which have already been caught contradicting their own claims with their own uploaded footage. There is no credible, verifiable body of pilot testimony describing an actual physical dome over the Earth. What exists instead is a well-documented, physically explainable altitude ceiling that varies by aircraft, exactly as engineering would predict, and exactly as it should not if a single shared barrier were really up there. This doesn't mean the underlying human fascination behind both stories isn't worth taking seriously, though, because it clearly is. There's something deeply, persistently human about looking upward and wanting there to be a structure, a limit and an edge, a ceiling holding back a much bigger and more chaotic universe beyond it. The Sumerians expressed that instinct through layered domes made of jasper and unnamed precious stone. Modern flat earth communities express a version of that same instinct through stories about pilots and invisible barriers at high altitude. Both are, in their own way, attempts to make an incomprehensibly vast universe feel smaller, more contained, and more comprehensible. The difference is that one of them is an honest artifact of ancient thought, preserved on clay tablets thousands of years old, offering us a genuine window into how early civilization tried to make sense of the sky. The other is a modern claim that can be, and has been, directly tested against real aviation data, real published aircraft specifications, and real physics, and it simply does not hold up when it is. What makes the Sumerian material genuinely worth revisiting, then, isn't that it secretly proves something modern science has missed. It's that it shows us, in remarkable and specific detail, exactly how a civilization without telescopes, without satellites, without any of our modern instruments, still managed to build an internally consistent, richly imagined model of the universe around them, one with layers, with gods assigned to each layer, with an origin story explaining how heaven and earth were pulled apart in the first place, and with rules about who was allowed to go where after death. That's not a small achievement. That's an entire cosmology built from nothing but careful observation, oral tradition, and imagination, sturdy enough that pieces of it were still being debated by scholars, philosophers, and religious authorities thousands of years later, echoing forward into Babylonian, Hebrew, and even much later, biblical descriptions of the sky as a solid firmament separating waters above from waters below. So, if you're looking for the version of this story that actually holds up, it's this. The Sumerians really did believe in a dome, and their beliefs really were remarkably specific, layered, and consistent, matched independently by cultures scattered all across the ancient world who had no contact with each other whatsoever. That part is real, documented, and worth understanding on its own terms. And what doesn't hold up is the idea that modern pilots have secretly confirmed any of it. What modern pilots actually experience at altitude is thinner air, reduced lift, reduced engine performance, and aircraft-specific ceilings that differ from one plane to the next exactly as engineering predicts, none of which points to a physical barrier in the sky. The real story here isn't a secret dome that modern aviation accidentally proves. The real story is how thoroughly and how creatively ancient people were able to build a coherent picture of the cosmos using nothing but their eyes and their imagination, and how easily that ancient imagery can be repackaged thousands of years later into modern claims that sound compelling but don't survive a basic check against how airplanes actually work.